the theme of the conference is beyond the hype. So I thought I'd start a little bit with the hype. What do these four have in common? Frankenstein. The guy is Frankenstein, by the way, not the monster. People always get that wrong. The man who fell in love, Pygmalion, who fell in love with a statue, the Golem of Prague, and the original robots, the universal robots from the Czech novel. What do these four have in common, apart from being fictional? Any ideas? Well, they have all been evoked by the group of the European Union that drafted that first attempt for new civil liability laws for robotics, directly there in the preamble. Having regard, whereas from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's monster to the classical myth of Pygmalion, through the story of Prague's Golem, to the robots of Karel Čapek, who coined the word, people have fantasized about the possibility of building intelligent machines, more often than not androids with human faces. So that's the way they start the recommendation for a quite radical reform of our law of civil liability. And we can wonder whether that was just a very clever pedagogical and rhetorical tool to get interest into a field that has been overlooked maybe and neglected, or whether that already sets the scene in a rather misleading and potentially quite problematic way. For instance, by focusing on anthropomorphic robots in human form, they probably leave aside the vast majority of AI applications. My washing machine has AI. My washing machine is a robot, according to the standard definition of what a robot is. It learns to adjust temperature and amount of cleaning liquid in response to cleanliness of the water in the dishwasher. It moves mechanical parts, that is, it opens or closes the valve that lets water into the dishwasher. That means, by the standard definition you find in robotics textbook, it's a robot. Do I think it should get legal personality? No, don't think so. Do I think it causes massively novel problems of liability? Well, yes and no, and we'll come to that a little bit later. But is there anything about the anthropomorphic nature of a robot, the Sophie example, that might give us pause and think about liability issues in particular? Well, to a certain extent, the design choices that go into making Sophia the way she looks are design choices. Unlike evolution and the way we look, they are not fate. There are some people who make that robot look the way it does. This has nothing to do with the AI that drives it. This is just the external appearance. But because they are choices, they potentially carry with them obligations, including legal obligations. So, for instance, how does Sophia see you? How would you say, does she sense her environment, its environment? I really should say its, I shouldn't fall for that. You might think, having seen the beautiful eyes, that the cameras are behind the eyes. There are cameras behind the eyes, but they're not the only cameras, because Sophia, unlike a human, has something much, much closer to 360-degree vision, which prevents it from bumping into things, which is a very good idea. It has wheels rather than legs, so can go back and forward, so being able to see in the back is actually quite necessary. So in a certain extent, Sophia deceives you about its sensorial capabilities. Does this matter? Well, I would say it does, definitely from a data protection perspective. And the way we interact with our environment, we learned. It's culturally embedded, driven by our evolutionary capacities. So, for instance, I was reasonably certain when I woke up this morning that modesty requires, and my self-interest demands, that I do take certain protective measures. That is, I got dressed. Getting dressed is a perfectly appropriate response for that specific audience, because I have a pretty good idea what your sensorial capacities are. That is, you only perceive in the normal visual wavelengths, and that's fine. Now, if one of you were bitten by a radioactive spider or something, and were able to, no, sorry, that's the wrong superhero, but able to see through walls, I think the privacy impact assessment for Superman would be something to read. I mean, I would love that. So if you had the ability to see through walls or through clothing, then obviously my response would have been hugely inadequate. And a robot obviously can potentially see on the infrared spectrum, see through heat emissions rather than through the optical spectrum. Might have much more acute hearing, so speaking in a subdued voice might not be a sufficient protection. So lots of things we do quite naturally to protect our privacy might not work if the robot is designed to be deceptive. And we might ask, shouldn't there be legal consequences for that? Maybe a duty to disclose in a much more obvious way what the capacities of that machine are, what it can actually see, so that we can take appropriate countermeasures. But that's not where it stops. Of course, these countermeasures can become problematic. This goes beyond the civil liability aspect that my talk focuses on, and it was too recent to include in my slideshow, unfortunately. But if you followed the news, there was quite a bit of discussion about the Metropolitan Police in London carrying out facial recognition tests. That is already highly problematic. I'm far from convinced that the privacy impact assessment and the protective measures that they took were sufficient. But what was much, much more worrying, a citizen walked by and he hit his face. And he was stopped and arrested for obstruction. Now, if I read PACE and the Criminal Evidence Act correctly, then police officers can demand you to take camouflage of your face, but only if a sufficiently senior officer, I think of the rank of Chief Super, has made an official declaration evoking the specific part of that enabling law for a period of 24 hours to be extended maximum to 48 hours in the concrete anticipation of criminal activities taking place in that area. I doubt that that declaration has been made, and if it had been made, I doubt that it would have been lawful, because there was no evidence of concrete specific criminal activity taking place. So on what grounds did the police request not just that they were doing it, that's one thing, but the active cooperation by the citizen? So I found this deeply, deeply worrying, but it also has impact on civil liability. At the moment, wearing anti-CCTV face paint is one passive countermeasure against surveillance that is perfectly legal to do, as is hiding your face, absent a authorization by a chief superintendent for the period of 24 hours in the anticipation of concrete times taking place in a specific designated geographical area. So lots and lots of passive countermeasures we are allowed to take. Will it be in the future prudent to take them? What happens if I did camouflage my face with anti-CCTV paint and as a consequence an automated car didn't spot me any longer and injured me? So it was my countermeasure, legal to carry out, that considerably contributed to the accident happening. Maybe the equivalent to run over a crossing at the moment in camouflage gear at night. Do I bear a certain amount of responsibility if there is an accident? Increasingly, in a robotic world, in a world with embedded AI and ubiquitous computing, will be subject to censoring all the time. And the question then becomes, if we do not cooperate, if we choose to hide our faces, to make distracting sounds for voice recognition and other sorts of activity, and we suffer a harm, is this partly our fault? Or is there still full liability on the side of the manufacturer, who might have to anticipate these types of countermeasures? And if third parties are harmed, so the car doesn't see me in time, sees me in the last minute, and then swerves around me, and unfortunately it was programmed by a non-utilitarian ethical AI, and it decides, oh well, I'd rather drive over Ian than over Burkhard. It's a great loss to the legal profession, and only a minimal loss to, sorry, I'm not going too deeply into that, but is that my fault then? I didn't do anything illegal. but through my behavior, I contributed in a potentially increasingly foreseeable way to an AI malfunctioning. So here we have already a considerable problem. Should there be specific duties to be upfront with the sensorial equipment AIs and robots have? And is there then a corresponding duty, and to what extent does it reach, for citizens to participate and not obstruct, not obfuscate? So here, product liability, traditional delictual or tortious liability, and data protection law interact in considerably problematic new ways. Data protection law requiring data protection by design and putting quite a premium on using countermeasures like obfuscation. That is seen as one not only legitimate but almost recommended response, and on the other hand, the danger of mistakes happening. So that is just the first thing, just from a design choice, the way we build them, that can be quite significant and has nothing to do yet with the intelligence. Headline quite recently, who is to blame when a robot goes haywire? We need answers now. A quite lurid headline. What is behind that? In Hong Kong, a investment banker, I think he is, started to litigate against a fund management company. That fund management company had advertised that it was using AI in picking the right stock. The way the company did this was to grasp a huge amount of data from the internet and do a sentiment analysis, trying to find out how many people have written about a specific stock, what's their attitude to it, positive or negative, how strong is the attitude, are they really, really against it, are they really, really in favor of it, and on that basis tried to anticipate how that stock would move. Tycoon invested quite a lot of money with this trust fund and lost about 30 million pounds because it underperformed the stock market, and he now sues because he says this AI malperformed. And immediately we get all sorts of questions. What does malperformance mean here? They never promised we can guarantee. If they were not totally stupid, they can't have promised we will guarantee no risk return on a high risk stock market investment, one would hope. So what is the benchmark here? That's something Ian already mentioned. Is it beating random choice? Were they better than random? Does it mean beating a averagely competent manager? Does it mean beating a tracker, so a investment vehicle that is also automated but simply follows the stock market development? We don't know. So it's a bit of a question, partly also obviously depending on the contract they had, what they could promise, what they did actually promise, and whether or not this was a mistake of the AI or just the AI performing perfectly in the way it does. Personally, and wearing a slightly different hat here, many years ago, I was involved in a European project to develop a AI, we would call it then, maybe not any longer today, of course it didn't do machine learning, that tried to detect fraudulent investment websites. And one of our prime case studies were websites that promised high return and no risk on investment because they were using psychics. And they were saying we have the best psychics in the world, and our psychics are totally capable of predicting the stock market. Personally, I would have probably trusted these psychics slightly more than this AI, but that is just me. With psychics, I know what goes on in their mind. With that AI, I'm not so sure. And that the crash with a self-driving Uber car, Ian already mentioned this. That is another example that is seen as posing specifically new problems for liability. So this is why this topic is now at the forefront of the public discourse, why there is interest in it, and why there is a feeling, at least, that the old rules, the traditional rules of liability, are inadequate. So that's the hype. Why might there be an issue? Well, some of them we already heard. It's the complexity of it and the black boxedness. We feel we do not really know what is going on here. What happened? Do we need to know this? Ian mentioned fMRI scans, where we are increasingly capable of drilling into what happens in human brains. And that is a very, very recent development. It does have some interesting applications also for liability law. For instance, people claiming to have whiplash trauma or some other physically difficult to establish injury. There, fMRI might provide a level of objective, I'm not so sure, a basis for that claim. But obviously our liability rules are much, much older than our ability to look into a human brain. So the human brain always was, to a certain extent, at least a black box to us, a highly complex neural network. And nonetheless, we understand the ways we attribute liability to people. So it might be that the need to actually go into that black box is not quite as problematic as we sometimes think. The complexity is partly simply caused by the amount of code and the amount of software that goes in. In an automated car, lots and lots of individual modules having to interact in the right way, all coming from different suppliers. So it's a sheer size and the complexity of integration that is the issue, that it comes from different sources. That very, very often lots and lots of independent entities are involved in creating this code, and it might be difficult to pinpoint who exactly made a mistake, if a mistake it was. The combination of code and training data. And AI is only as good as the training data that it receives. So it might be that the code is absolutely fine, but that the database was biased, for instance, the problem with the sentencing support system Compass in the US, or for some other reason flawed, not any longer up to date. Who is responsible for that? And the opacity of neural networks, that is the brain analogy, that even if we understand the training data and the code, it might be difficult to find out what exactly the step was when the learning went wrong. Just as an aside, there's a bit of a misunderstanding here. AIs are still deterministic machines. That if you feed the same data to the same neural network, you should get the same outcome. So post-factum testing in a relatively traditional way is actually possible. That we can't anticipate when it hasn't happened yet what the learning outcome will be is a slightly different issue. Yeah? Replication and replicability, which is typically what in a litigation context we are interested in, is a slightly different issue from predictability and uncertainty of an outcome. If you do fire litigation and you want to find out was it an accident or was it intentional, then what the forensic expert will do is to replicate. They will build the flat as closely to the original as possible and see what sort of traces would it leave if the fire started here and it was by accident or whether it was artificially created. So we don't know in advance how that fire would spread, but after the event we can recreate it, and that is still possible even with AIs. And then there's something, especially continental European lawyers, in my experience, immediately jump on, and it's sort of the way we are trained, I think. Common lawyers do it as well. There's this feeling that these machines make decisions and therefore potentially intervene in the causal chain. They are not totally predictable, and then they do something, and then we feel there is a disruption of the chain of attribution, and that is something that needs to be taken into account of, and quite a lot of the proposals like legal personality come from this. And I actually blame us academics for that, personally, because that is how we train first year or second year law students. We give them lots and lots of highly hypothetical, extremely unrealistic ways in which causal chains can be broken, just to train them to spot that as an issue. I had to learn 6 different theories of causality when I did my criminal law exam. They all came to the same result, so it was totally pointless. But I still had to learn them and had to discuss them. So that is how we are cognitively formed. As soon as there is something that looks a little bit odd when it comes to causality and interpreting chain, we fall back to second year law school. And there must be an issue. And I don't think there is one, personally, for all sorts of reasons. But then again, this is classical operating systems. These are not AIs, this is not machine learning. Just look at the way in which the complexity of the code has increased in the recent years. I know, even with my Apple, that there are bugs on it. A colleague in Edinburgh in the 1980s had given a formal proof why we can be certain that there are bugs on it. It will sometimes behave in unexpected ways. Not because there's an AI on it, but simply because it is by now so complex that we can't formally guarantee that it will always work to specifications. So this is not a new problem. This is something that we find in traditional complex software anyway. We can't any longer go through these million lines of code and pinpoint where exactly did it go wrong. And there might be several mistakes that balance each other out, for instance. So very, very often, this issue precedes the issue of AI. This is a visualization of contributor networks in open source projects. Again, we are used to the problem that lots and lots of people contribute and that we might not always know who did the problematic contribution. This is also not necessarily new. So I'm not convinced for these reasons that there's a conceptually new problem necessarily coming up here. This doesn't mean that we should have business like normal, because I'm also not sure that we got our rules on software liability right. Maybe we should not have allowed Microsoft and others to provide buggy software that is susceptible to cyber attacks. Having a relatively lenient liability regime allowed the growth of the sector, absolutely. We might have prevented a bit of innovation happening had the rules been stricter and more traditional. On the other hand, these are the problems we now have to fight with, entirely building our infrastructure on something that is inherently unsafe and trying to patch it all the time and to repair it, because we are doing most of our commerce now on a system that was never designed for this and has vulnerabilities that expose us to significant dangers. So maybe we should learn the lessons in that sense from the past and say, no, actually we want stricter rules, even though the problems are essentially still the same. We can and we should demand more, just as a thought. Autonomy, as I said, that's the sort of thing people immediately jump on. These things look as if they are alive, as if they are making choices. That's new, isn't it? Well, to a degree. That's a policing robot arresting a suspect, having identified that person as carrying a weapon. And that seems to be new. What if that robot exceeds permissible force and shoots a suspect? We might not be able to predict it because it has learned to recognize a weapon. Guard dogs. Since the dawn of civilization, I would say almost as a definition of civilization, we have surrounded ourselves with automated decision makers that needed training. If you have a dog, then there will be lots of people responsible for the dog's behavior. The person who trained it, which might not be the owner. The breeder, who might have combined dog breeds that are inherently dangerous, the owner and its behavior, and the person interacting with the dog. And nonetheless, we are normally capable of sorting this out. If you get your dog from a dog shelter, which, by the way, is the only ethically acceptable way of getting a dog, please put that down in your notebooks, and you will be tested on it later on, then obviously you have the significant risk that this dog will come with a history that you don't know. And again, its reasoning is opaque to you. You can't look into its brain. And nonetheless, our legal system, I think, copes quite well with that. Automated drivers, we already mentioned. That seems to be new. Well, yes, obviously, we have horses. Your average horse is considerably more autonomous and can have a considerably broader range of decision-making than your car. Your car isn't going to bite you. These things do. And I speak from experience. Your car doesn't get started if a bee stings at us either. So, and a car in particular stays on the road. Those of you who are British and grew up before the 1990s, how do you defeat a Dalek? Important robotics question.
Yes, you just take it to a staircase.
Exactly. Daleks, these terrifying killing robots, couldn't walk upstairs at that time, so the only thing they had to do was walking up the stairs. With automated cars, that's the same thing. The hardware constrains massively what they can do. They might do all sorts of unexpected things on the software side, but the hardware still imposes significant constraints that don't apply in the same way to horses. Horses can actually walk upstairs under certain conditions. And then Tay, the AI, the one that could talk and that was induced unexpectedly for a designer to develop rather racist attitudes, simply because it was trolled on the internet by a group of Reddit people who fed it consistently sort of racist propaganda, and to the horror of the Microsoft folks suddenly proclaimed that Hitler was a great statesman. So that really, really worried people because, again, it seemed to show the poor developers that wasn't their fault. It was what it learned from, which was unforeseeable. We also had that in law. This was a parrot that was trained to yell, the police is coming, warning its owners. And there are other examples of parrots witnessing crime and having learned key phrases or being sent to insult people. So training an autonomous, intelligent decision maker to repeat messages or to respond to messages, that again is not necessarily new. We had this and the legal system was able to cope with that. So with all these alleged new features, the autonomy in particular, I think our society has coped admirably well in the past with things that were far, far, far more intelligent and far, far more autonomous in many ways than what we see with your average robot. So I think that alone is a, well, for caution. Yes, and obviously that's another intelligent, dangerous, autonomous decision-making machine, that's us. My God, they are conscious, they can plan and act autonomously, but nobody programmed them with the 3 laws of robotics. Dr. Cohen decided that all humans must die. We are still considerably more dangerous than your standard robot. So is it only business as usual? I don't think so either. Just we need to identify the right issues, the things that really should give us pause for thought. I already mentioned the ability to interact with sensors and what that means in our interaction with them. I think we need changes to the law of evidence and procedure. We simply need new types. I think that is, I know, I go into detail a bit later. So it's not so much the substantive law necessarily that is under challenge, but the procedural law. How do you prove what? What is the access right that you have to data? How does, in a US setting, how does disclosure work? What are your disclosure rights here? And with that come changes to the law on data preservation and curation. How much of the data do I have to store to be able to show what happened in a specific point in time? And again, we get, I think, a potential conflict here between data protection and liability laws. That from a liability perspective, there will be an incentive to store massive amounts of data. From a data protection perspective, there's obviously a countervailing obligation to minimize data, and I think we will need to redefine a little bit that tension between them. Changes to the insurance regime, that is also something Ian already mentioned, and I think one of the most promising and most sensible approaches. We have dealt with dangerous technologies through the insurance regime for quite some time. And the changes that are potentially needed here is we don't necessarily mandate insurance out of a normative concern primarily. We don't necessarily force drivers or car owners to insure themselves because we feel objectively that they are responsible if their car is stolen and then causes an accident, or their teenage son drives it and they're causing an accident and all that. That is not what drives it. The reason to allocate insurance with the owner is that it makes pragmatic sense. It is quick and easy for the victim to get compensation, but it also allows insurance companies to leverage the economic weight to make things safer. That the number of car thefts and house burglaries have decreased dramatically in the UK, making our government really happy because the crime statistics since the 80s were really looking good. That's insurance companies, because they give you premiums for having proper locks and using the latest technology for theft prevention. So quite a lot of theft prevention, both in residential dwellings and in cars, came from the insurance industry, and the safety provisions in cars as well. You get your money back, you get a rebate. So insurance companies were able to leverage this because people were able to make choices. You were able to choose whether you want to install an airbag or whether you want to install ABS braking. If this choice disappears, because the cars are increasingly autonomous and you are not allowed to fiddle and manipulate them any longer because that would be way too dangerous, that function of the insurance player disappears. And I would think because of that reason, no other reason, not about who is to blame, if you like, but who is best placed to mitigate harm, mandating mandatory insurance by the manufacturers for quite a number of these products makes tremendously sense, because they then can go to the manufacturers and say, if you do it right, if you document good quality insurance standards, if you take the certification that Ian, I think, also mentioned, then we reduce your premium. And that would be using that leverage at the appropriate place. Changes to the standards of required care, that's again something Ian touched upon. Absolutely true, again, the European proposal as well went beyond standard strict liability to something much closer to absolute liability, which I think indeed is problematic. But what are the sort of things you need to do? Maybe developing standards that then result in certification as one possibility to determine the state of the art, some element of social acceptability. I might not have time to go back to that, but potentially I would. On the evidence and procedure side, we made a submission recently to the German Ministry of Justice on AI in consumer protection law. The main concern was AIs that discriminate against credit applicants and differential pricing, automated price setting on websites. And we came to the analysis, to the conclusion that a post factum analysis was all that was necessary and feasible. So we don't need to see the code. We don't even need to drill back why an individual decision was taken. We just create the obligation to disclose periodically, annually, biannually, the data of how many applicants did you have and what were your decisions as population data. And then you ask, an AI, ideally, are there patterns in there that look problematic? Do people from ethnic minorities get the number of positive credit answers that they should expect? And these methods exist, and they again predate AI. In the US, they came with the civil rights movement in the 1970s. So there are quite a lot of these mechanisms that have been in place for quite some time. Disclosure of code might sometimes be necessary. To what extent should commercial sensitivity prevent and interact here with liability law? In the US, the problematic Compass decision on sentencing, when lawyer counsel for the defense challenged the decision, they were essentially told by the court, we can't tell you how the AI came to the result because we don't own the software. It's a third-party supplier. We have confidentiality agreements. We can't disclose this. Rubbish to that. As a public authority in particular, you should not sign this sort of contract. You should always be able, for judicial review purposes, to disclose if so required. And from IP law, we obviously have mechanisms to do this. In IP litigation, there are perfectly sound ways to disclose code to the other side in a protected environment to see whether an infringement took place. There's absolutely no reason to find the same way in the rules of civil evidence and procedure and use them more consistently. Who counts as an expert? We have a huge problem in the UK here. The Office of the Forensic Regulator doesn't have statutory powers. The government has been dragging its heels on that for ages. I do think we need not just certification of AIs, we need certification of AI experts, especially for forensic and expert purposes. Explainable AI is something big in the law of data protection law. Again, we require from AIs to explain why they reached a certain conclusion. We could think of similar explainable AI criteria also from civil liability. For liability, you want different types of explanations than you want for data protection, simply because different values are at stake. So you would have to rethink how this looks on the technical side, but it's, I think, technologically doable. Do I still have 5 minutes, I think? Data curation and preservation, again, that is a question where the law might have to adjust. In fintech, under MiFID, we already have that. Certain types of AI-enabled high-frequency trading require to preserve snapshots of both the training data and the algorithm at that time for auditing purposes. That might be something to also consider in other areas and put it on a statutory footing. Black box from the aviation industry, sometimes also suggested for automated cars, having a device that records what is going on, again, as a statutory requirement. And one of the things that I personally think we should have much more aggressively, post-event reporting and monitoring. We do this with medical drugs. We have a methodology where if I report to my GP a negative side effect of a drug, that is reported to a central repository where patterns are identified, and if necessary, the manufacturer is informed that they must withdraw this. We might want to think for some types of AI applications of something similar, that there's simply a channel of communication, that a line of communication that accumulates this data post-release. Insurance companies are already mattered. I finish with a couple of slightly off-field ideas of mine. That's always a risk if you invite me. How many AIs do you see? One of the proposals of the European Union was mandatory insurance for AIs, or for robots. How many are there?
Almost everything there.
I would say the answer is really, really tricky. The answer could be one. You see one giant AI, which is a smart city. So the environment, the infrastructure, plus the cars are one thing. Or you could say each of these individual cars are one robot that requires insurance. Or you could say every individual, or you could say the fleet of the cars, but not with the infrastructure, is one AI. They are driven by a central server, and that is just one big robot with lots and lots of tentacles, each car being an arm of the robot rather than an individual entity. Or you could drill into the car and say, well, each of the components constitutes one robot that carries, or an AI that requires its own insurance. This is actually quite difficult to say. So if you say in law, you need to insure robots, how many? Which ones? What is the entity here? Same with Cortana or Siri. How many of them are there? One on each mobile phone, for each owner, regardless how many copies they have on multiple devices. Who knows? So these are some decisions that we would have to take because our normal intuitions about identity do not apply. We are all different. I understand my difference from you. But with AIs or robots, that's not quite the case. They are manufactured to be the same thing to a certain extent. This is just fantasy and philosophers talking about identity because that's what we do. Well, consider the following. Under European law, there is a ceiling for insurance payouts in car accidents of, I think, €1 million. Or no, what was it, 20 million? Doesn't matter, there's a ceiling, that is the important thing. And that allows insurance companies to calculate their risk. They know how many cars they have insured, and then they know what the worst that could happen be, and then they reinsure themselves. For driverless cars, what you factor in, for uninsured cars, you factor in how often cars are stolen. And you can say, well, it's relatively unlikely that this car is stolen. There's a certain likelihood it then causes an accident. The ceiling is 20 million. That allows me to do risk management. Now imagine someone steals an autonomous car by hacking into the central server and takes over all the cars of the same make, 200,000 at the same time. Can't drive them all, but it can drive them all into the next wall. How many insurance events do we have? One with the 20 million ceiling, because there was one hacking attack on the central server that affected all these cars, or 200,000. 200,000 times 20 million. Is there any insurance company or reinsurance company who has that sort of money? I don't think so. So how we count these entities and their identity criteria actually matter. We had this a little bit with Sophie. Upgrades. If I upgrade a robot or an AI, is it still the same AI? If I certify it, what do I certify? Do I certify the latest patch? Do I certify the latest version? If we make contracts, and that gets us back to liability, it's not enough to say at this point in time, the training set was certified and the algorithm was certified, all is fine. It's just as important to say how often was it updated? How many patches were there? How quickly are patches to be released once a vulnerability is found? So all these things, I think, do require rethink. And with that, I reached the end, and I came up, no, not me, Saturday morning breakfast cereal, who are, I think, the most incisive commentators on lots of things. They came up with a flow chart that tells us that everything is fine, I think. And on that happy note, and as you'll see, it always ends up in all humans get killed. I thank you again for your attention, and thank you, Ian, for inviting me.